Benefit Street in Providence still carries the echoes of a name most tried to erase Deacon Ezra Rutherford. He was once a man of faith, but his devotion turned so warped that he convinced himself his cellar was a gateway to heaven. Between 1762 and 1765, neighbors whispered about eerie sounds from his home. Children's voices crying in languages no child could possibly know rose from beneath the ground. The voices blended into hymn-like melodies that unsettled anyone passing by. At night, people crossed themselves and hurried along the street, afraid to linger. When authorities finally forced open Rutherford's basement in March 1765, they uncovered horrors so disturbing that the colonial government locked away the records for over a century. Inside lay the remains of twin children who had never seen sunlight. Their skin was ghostly pale, their eyes shaped by eternal darkness. The cellar was filled with crude altars, strange symbols with no known religious origin, and journals where Rutherford justified the slow murder of innocents under the guise of saving their souls. Generations later, families who tried to live in the Rutherford house never lasted more than a month. Each claimed the same terrifying experiences: children's voices drifting beneath the floors, the smell of oil lamps where none burned, and the touch of unseen hands brushing against their ankles. The Rutherford house itself stood tall on a hill overlooking Providence Harbor, a symbol of Puritan prosperity, but its foundation concealed secrets that could shatter the strongest faith. Providence in 1762 was a city split between tradition and change. Puritan ideals still shaped daily life. Yet the port brought sailors, merchants, and foreign ideas that tested the moral walls Roger Williams had built a century earlier. Ships arrived weekly from the Caribbean, carrying molasses, rum, and stories of different cultures. But beneath the trade lay darker truths, the human bondage that enriched Providence while poisoning its soul. Merchants filled church pews each Sunday, asking forgiveness for sins they had no plan to abandon. Deacon Ezra Rutherford embodied this contradiction. By day, he was a respected preacher whose sermons brought merchants to tears. He was tall and gaunt, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to expose the sins people hid behind polite masks. His voice carried the weight of a man who believed he had wrestled with angels. Yet he owned 3 ships, the Mercy, the Providence, and the Salvation vessels that tied him to the very trade he condemned. For Rutherford, faith and commerce were locked in battle, and the basement of his home became the stage where his torment twisted into madness. Ezra Rutherford's mansion on Benefit Street showed his wealth, but in a way that reflected his strict, almost punishing sense of faith. The imported furniture was sturdy rather than lavish. Silverware from London served practical meals instead of decoration. And entire walls were lined with books in English, Latin, and Greek, mostly theology. Unlike other grand homes in Providence, there were no portraits, no painted landscapes, no signs of vanity. His house was prosperous, but joyless, and that design revealed the conflict in Ezra's soul. Each success in trade only deepened his suspicion that prosperity was a curse pulling him away from God. Providence itself seemed to him a city sinking into moral decay. He watched young men from good families crowd into taverns at the waterfront, laughing, singing crude song, and stumbling through streets like sinners on parade. Women dressed in gowns, Ezra thought flaunted vanity rather than piety. Even the church pews felt corrupted. Wealthy members arrived in fine carriages, whispered about business deals, and compared social invitations, while sermons about salvation passed them by. Ezra grew convinced that no one in Providence but him recognized how far they had fallen. His wife Mercy was 20 years younger. She wore her grandmother's white cap, her auburn hair hidden beneath it, and carried herself with the quiet humility that had drawn Ezra to her. She had been just 18 when she married him, grateful to escape the hardship of her childhood, a failed farmer for a father, a mother dead from consumption and years of poverty. Their marriage brought stability and comfort, but it was marked by a painful absence. They could not have children. For years, whispers spread among neighbors, while behind closed doors, Ezra and Mercy carried their grief in silence. Ezra believed it was divine punishment for his dealings in commerce, while Mercy blamed herself for sins she could not name. Even consultations with Providence's best doctor, Dr. Hamilton, had no effect. The lack of children pushed Ezra deeper into theology, but it also pulled him toward the shadows of the city. He claimed he wandered taverns and brothels to study sin, but in truth, they fascinated him. By watching others give in to desire, he felt a dark thrill, a taste of freedom. His rigid self-control denied him. That fascination only grew as he convinced himself he was observing sinners in order to defeat sin itself. When Mercy finally conceived in the spring of 1762, Ezra took it as a sign from God. He preached that his faith had been tested and proven worthy. But as summer wore on and Mercy's belly grew, Ezra's tone shifted. His sermons became darker, filled with warnings that even newborns could not escape corruption. He thundered that children entered the world pure, but were poisoned instantly by the sins surrounding them, their spiritual promise stolen before they spoke a single word. At home, Ezra withdrew. He spent hours in the stone basement of their house, saying its silence and darkness allowed him to commune with God more directly. Soon he began avoiding social events altogether, refusing invitations with an edge of disdain. Even when forced to attend a church gathering or a business meeting, his words grew sharper, his patience thinner. Those closest to him began to notice the change the way he looked at the world now. Not with pity or hope, but with suspicion and a growing sense of doom. Mercy could not ignore the way Ezra's eyes lingered on children in the streets, watching them too intently, as though they were puzzles waiting to be solved. On October 17, 1762, Providence woke under a heavy Atlantic sky, the air sharp with a wind that cut through wool and hinted at an early winter. The harbor lay beneath a gray shroud, and the city felt distant, hushed, as though Providence itself was holding its breath. Mercy's labor began before dawn, her contractions steady as church bells and forceful as waves pounding the breakwater. Goodwife Prescott arrived before sunrise, her worn satchel filled with herbs and instruments. Ezra had sent the servants away, insisting childbirth was too sacred to be witnessed by hired hands. That left only Mercy, the midwife, and Ezra pacing above the chamber like a restless shadow. He had been awake for more than a day, moving in constant rhythm with his wife's cries, stopping only to kneel in prayer or read scripture on birth blessing and divine purpose. The house itself seemed to take on a strange vitality, the timbers echoing his footsteps in time with Mercy's struggle. The labor dragged on each contraction, leaving Mercy gasping as though she fought an enemy rather than endured a natural trial. Prescott, who had delivered children for 4 decades, noticed unsettling details she would never forget. The air in the room stayed unnaturally cold despite the hearth fire, and the shadows flickered against the walls in ways that had nothing to do with the flames. When the first infant's cry broke through the house at 9:07, Ezra dropped to his knees, arms raised, and his booming prayer of thanks filled every corner of the mansion. Then Prescott announced a second child was on the way. Ezra's expression changed instantly. The sleepless intensity in his gray eyes hardened into something that unsettled the midwife enough to make her step back from the bed. Twins were rare and always subject to interpretation, blessing, or curse depending on belief. That the most prominent deacon in Providence would father two at once meant their birth would be the subject of endless speculation. Samuel Rutherford came first, a strong, dark-haired boy who filled the room with a lusty cry. His small fists clenched with vigor, his frame already promising the strength of a laborer. When his eyes opened, they were the deep, uncertain blue of all newborns, waiting to settle into the color of his parents. 12 minutes later, Judith entered the world smaller and with more struggle, but alive and healthy. She bore her mother's auburn hair and delicate features, her cry softer but insistent. When placed beside her brother, she quieted almost instantly, her tiny hand curling against his arm. Goodwife Prescott, who thought she had seen everything, paused at the sight. Most infants were unaware of anything beyond hunger and warmth. Yet Samuel and Judith seemed bound to each other from the first breath. Their bond was not the usual comfort of siblings, but something deeper, as if even in their earliest moments they shared a secret language meant for them alone. When one twin cried, the other instinctively turned toward the sound. And when placed together, they always curled into the same positions they had once shared in the womb. Goodwife Prescott, who had seen more births than she could count, declared them the strongest, healthiest twins she had delivered in 3 decades. But while Mercy's heart filled with gratitude, Ezra's first moments of fatherhood carried a darker weight. As he stood at the bedroom window, holding Samuel and Judith, he watched drunken young men stagger home from the taverns, their coarse laughter echoing down the cobblestones. To Ezra, it felt like a message this world was not fit for souls as unblemished as the ones in his arms. Unlike other parents who would watch innocence gradually erode under the stain of worldly influence, he believed God had chosen him to protect purity itself, to preserve it forever. 3 days after the birth, when society expected a public announcement and a stream of congratulatory visits, Ezra broke with tradition. He told only a select few that Mercy was still weak and the children too fragile for visitors. It was a lie, but one that bought him time. In his private prayers, he had already begun to call it his plan of preservation. Each night while Mercy slept the heavy sleep of a woman recovering from childbirth, Ezra watched the twins and convinced himself he was witnessing the divine in its purest form. Faces untouched by sin, spirits still unspoiled. It was not enough to hope they would grow into righteousness. He had been given a sacred duty to ensure they never strayed at all. The basement of the Rutherford house became the focus of his vision. It stretched beneath the main floor, its thick stone walls designed to muffle sound, its chambers long used for storage and quiet prayer. Ezra had always retreated there for solitude, but now he began to see it differently, as a sanctuary, a sacred refuge where purity could be kept safe from corruption. He set about the transformation with the same precision that had made him successful in business. He installed oil lamps in alcoves cut into the stone, their flames steady and shielded, so they burned without flicker. Reflected light bathed the room in a calm glow, soft and even, which Ezra claimed was more fitting for holy contemplation than the harsh worldly sunlight above. He laid down thick Persian rugs, luxuries he would never display upstairs, and used them to create separate areas for sleeping, eating, and prayer. From fine pine he built small beds, inscribing the frames with scripture verses chosen to bless innocence and safeguard purity. He placed them against the warmest wall where heat from the kitchen hearth above would seep down through the stone in the bitter New England winters. Most ambitious of all, Ezra engineered an airflow system hidden behind stone and timber, drawing in fresh air through concealed vents he could control. It was a merchant's ingenuity turned to spiritual purpose, a way to create perfect conditions without windows that might expose the children to the sight of a corrupted world. Every detail from light to warmth to breath itself was arranged for one goal: to raise Samuel and Judith in a sanctuary where innocence would never be touched by sin. Ezra's vision of a sanctuary took shape with unsettling precision. He arranged a dining area the table scaled for a family that would one day grow into it, surrounded by chairs waiting for children to mature from toddlers to adults. The table was always set not with ornate silver or gilded china, but with pewter plates and cups functional. Simple a reflection of his belief that godliness lay in use, not display. At the far end of the room stood a small altar positioned so that daily prayers and scripture readings would shape every moment of his children's lives. Shelves lined one wall packed with books, Ezra hand-selected, multiple Bible's works from the early church fathers, hymnals, and devotional poetry. Every volume reinforced his tightening vision of doctrine. What was missing spoke louder than what was present. No secular writings, no philosophy, no history, nothing that might tempt Samuel and Judith to look beyond the narrow walls of his faith. When Mercy asked why he spent so many hours underground, often laboring until dawn, Ezra assured her he was preparing a nursery safe from Providence's drafts and diseases. His reasoning was believable, even comforting. Infant mortality haunted every mother in New England, and the basement was indeed warmer, quieter, and less exposed than the upper floors. What Mercy didn't see was the truth. Hidden beneath his words, Ezra wasn't protecting his children from sickness, but from the very world above their heads. As November settled in with long nights and marrow-deep cold, Ezra moved his plan forward. He began insisting that the twins needed absolute quiet, their fragile constitutions too vulnerable for the parade of visitors who typically followed a birth. His argument fit neatly with medical advice of the time Dr. Hamilton himself had warned about illnesses brought in by well-meaning friends. Ezra, however, took it further, preaching that outside influences could not only infect their bodies, but also their souls. Mercy, still weak from childbirth and secretly grateful to avoid the suffocating rituals of new mother society, agreed to limit visits. What Ezra called a short precaution stretched into weeks, then into permanence. When he finally revealed the finished nursery, Mercy was disarmed by its beauty. The chamber was warm, filled with soft light from steady oil lamps, furnished with rugs and carved beds, and centered on an altar that gave the room the feel of a private chapel. The twins thrived there, gaining weight quickly, their eyes bright with alertness. Mercy spent her days in the chamber, nursing them, lulled into believing her husband's choices were acts of love. What she did not see, at least not yet, was how carefully Ezra had secured their isolation. The basement's single oak door, barred and locked from the outside, meant no one could enter or leave without him. The high, narrow windows admitted only slivers of daylight and no view of the world above. And the thick stone walls, so good at keeping warmth and quiet, also muffled sound until nothing within could reach the street. The space Mercy thought was a nursery was in fact a cell, one designed with such care that its captives might never realize they were prisoners. The first month passed peacefully, almost deceptively so. Samuel and Judith flourished under their mother's care. Ezra's voice filled the chamber during morning and evening prayers, deep and resonant, as he thanked God for the gift of children uncorrupted by the world. In those moments, the basement seemed less like confinement and more like a holy sanctuary. Mercy, comforted by the illusion, convinced herself her husband's unusual ways were temporary. A pious man's eccentricity, not a permanent fate for her children. Ezra wasted no time in shaping his children's world. Before Samuel and Judith could even focus their eyes, he began teaching them hymns, convinced that sacred music would imprint holiness on their souls from the first stirrings of awareness. The family routine soon settled into a pattern that seemed ordinary enough, though cloistered. Mercy rose with the twins for their morning feeding, after which she and Ezra shared breakfast in the basement dining room while he read scripture aloud. Each meal ended with prayer before Ezra left to handle business matters above ground. Mercy's days passed in quiet care nursing, reading aloud from the approved library, and tending the small underground home that had become her universe. But as the days shortened and winter pressed in, Ezra's rules began to harden. His theology shifted toward extremes, and with it his expectations for life below ground. He insisted Mercy spend less time upstairs, warning that her contact with the outside world might carry unseen corruption back to their children. The servants above were a necessary evil, he argued, but their very presence tainted the upper floors. Better that Mercy stay below a constant guardian, ensuring the children's purity remained intact. At first, Mercy resisted with practical excuses. She would slip upstairs to prepare special meals for the twins, tend to household tasks, or correspond with distant relatives. Yet each time she left, Ezra's agitation grew worse. He paced the stone floors, muttered frantic prayers, and greeted her return with such obvious relief that Mercy began to feel guilt for ever leaving. Gradually, her trips upstairs became rarer, until she too was folded into the cloistered rhythm of basement life. Their meals changed as well. Once Ezra had prided himself on providing the finest foods his merchant business could acquire. But now, he declared such abundance a spiritual danger. Elaborate dishes gave way to the simplest fare bread milk water. Plain sustenance, he said, freed them from gluttony and allowed more time for prayer and study. To Ezra, hunger was not an enemy, but a reminder that the spirit mattered more than the flesh. Mercy, isolated from friends and family, slowly became dependent on Ezra for every piece of news from the outside world. The stories he brought were always bleak. Providence, he said, was unraveling. Children were learning lies and theft before they could even speak properly. Families once known for righteousness were sliding into sin. Even the church was straying from salvation, obsessed with wealth and vanity. Each tale reinforced his claim. The world above was poisoned, and only complete separation could save their children from its contagion. Yet while Ezra thundered about purity in the hidden chamber below his own steps above ground, told another story. The same man who locked his wife and children in a sanctuary of innocence spent his time in taverns, brothels, and the very corners of Providence he condemned from the pulpit. His crusade to preserve purity was paired with secret indulgence in the corruption he claimed to despise. Ezra Rutherford's double life deepened as the winter of 1762 gave way to the spring of 1763, and the shift did not go unnoticed. Parishioners who once sought him out for comfort now found him distant, his gaze cold, and measuring as though he were less a pastor than a scholar dissecting their flaws. His sermons, once filled with hope and grace, became urgent warnings, painting vivid pictures of corruption infecting the innocent and calling on parents to take radical steps to shield their children. To Ezra, there was no middle ground. A child was either a vessel of righteousness or of sin, and any failure to guard against worldly influence was nothing less than a parent's betrayal of the soul they had been entrusted to protect. Yet what disturbed Providence most was not only what Ezra preached, but how he lived when the pulpit was behind him. He began frequenting the city's waterfront taverns, not to save souls, but to study vice as though it were a science. He lurked in the shadows, listening to sailors' drunken boasts, watching men gamble away wages and recording every detail in his mind. He told himself he was cataloging corruption, so he could shield Samuel and Judith from its snares, but his secret journals revealed the darker truth. These expeditions gave him a taste of freedom his rigid faith denied. He watched others indulge in pleasures he would never allow himself, and in doing so, he fed both his curiosity and the desires he dared not name. Observation soon ceased to satisfy him. Ezra began what he chillingly referred to as experiments in moral degradation. He would carefully manipulate people to test how quickly their virtue could be corroded when temptation was placed before them. Families in need found themselves offered discreet financial help, but only after Ezra had seen them falter. A widow caught stealing scraps to feed her children might wake to find coins left at her door. Yet Ezra's help came with invisible strings. He ensured her dependence grew, encouraging the very theft that had first drawn his attention, until she became living proof of his belief that desperation always birthed sin. Young men drowning in gambling debts were quietly approached by a gentleman offering loans at fair terms. Ezra then followed them through Providence's streets, documenting their decline. Some squandered the money at gaming tables within days. Others wasted it on alcohol and prostitutes. In every case, Ezra noted the same outcome once corruption touched a soul. It spread like infection, devouring restraint, decency, and dignity until nothing was left. In his basement sanctuary, Ezra prayed over his children and preached purity. Above ground, he engineered sin like a chemist, stirring poison into a cup, convinced that both halves of his life served the same purpose. He believed he was proving a divine truth that the world was lost beyond saving, and only through total isolation could his own children remain uncorrupted. Ezra's most disturbing behaviors emerged in his dealings with children beyond his own. Under the cover of religious instruction, he began visiting households where parents welcomed a deacon's guidance, believing he was there to strengthen their children's faith. In reality, Ezra was conducting psychological experiments. He told carefully designed stories that planted doubts about parental authority or introduced subtle cracks in the children's trust in Scripture. He would return weeks later, quietly observing how those seeds of doubt had grown. The children he selected were never random. They came from families weakened by poverty, parents who worked long hours, or homes where natural curiosity already set a child apart. With gifts, kind words, and patient attention, Ezra won their confidence, only to turn it into an opportunity for manipulation. While Providence bustled with spring trade and the harbor filled with returning ships, the Rutherford basement remained a world sealed off from seasons. Samuel and Judith, now 6 months old, developed in ways that simultaneously thrilled and horrified their father. Their communication seemed unnatural. Instead of typical infant babble, their first sounds echoed fragments of hymns and Scripture-distorted imitations of the constant prayers that filled their underground days. When Ezra occasionally brightened the room with extra lamps, their response was chilling. They shrank from the light, crying and covering their eyes as though sunlight itself was an attack. To Ezra, this was not alarming, but validating. He took it as proof that his children had adapted to purity, the dimness of their sanctuary, and would reject the corruption that came with the world above. Physically, the twins thrived, but emotionally and socially, they were unlike any children Providence had ever known. They showed no interest in strangers, no instinct to explore, no distress at isolation. They seemed perfectly content in their dim stone world, playing with Ezra's hand-carved wooden toys and listening to their father's booming prayers or Mercy's soft hymns. Their contentment confirmed to Ezra that his methods had worked. To him, Samuel and Judith were living evidence that innocence could be preserved forever through isolation and divine instruction. But outside the home, Ezra's activities revealed a mind unraveling. What had begun as detached observation of sin had evolved into orchestrating corruption himself. He poured money into the waterfront gambling houses, not for wealth, but to study destruction. By backing card games and betting halls, he ensured that men who might otherwise have walked away had endless access to temptation. He watched them sink into debt, despair, and ruin, and he recorded every detail as though charting the progress of a disease. Ezra still claimed his actions were wholly research. But the truth was clear. He was no longer merely documenting sin. He was feeding it, cultivating it, turning Providence into a laboratory of moral collapse. The more he isolated his own children in the basement, the deeper he immersed himself in the vices he condemned, as though testing the extremes of both purity and corruption at once. Ezra's growing entanglement with sin reached a grotesque stage as he began using his wealth to bankroll drinking sessions for groups of sailors. He watched them descend into drunken chaos, following their stumbling paths through Providence's streets, all the while recording their every misstep with both revulsion and a terrible hunger for the spectacle. What horrified him also fascinated him. In his mind, each drunken collapse or shouted obscenity confirmed the inevitability of corruption, and this belief only strengthened his conviction that Samuel and Judith must remain sealed away in purity. But it also warped how he saw Mercy. Her confinement in the basement was eroding her body and spirit in ways too gradual to alarm her at first. Though she ate enough, she grew thinner, her skin paling to a sickly translucence from lack of sunlight. More troubling was the quiet unraveling of her mind. Isolated for months, Mercy began speaking aloud to voices only she could hear. Phantom visitors who carried gossip from the outside world. Friends who no longer came in imagined gatherings, where she described dresses, meals, and conversations in vivid detail. Her memories blurred with fantasies until her basement life felt like a shadow compared to the imagined social world she spoke of. The twins responded to her decline with eerie synchronicity. At the same hours each day, they cried in unison, not with the irregular wails of ordinary infants, but with harmonies that echoed unnaturally in the stone chamber. Their sounds rose and fell in strange cadences, resembling chants more than cries. Mercy, caught in her own unraveling, called it singing and believed it proof of the spiritual purity Ezra had promised. To her, Samuel and Judith were not distressed. They were communing with the divine. Yet to any outside observer, their strange patterned cries were signs of children molded by abnormal conditions, inventing a language born of isolation and their father's relentless theology. The fragile structure of Ezra's experiment cracked one night, when he returned from observing the ruin of a young merchant's son who had gambled his inheritance into oblivion. Entering the basement, he found Mercy swaying in the dim lamplight, with Samuel and Judith, all three of them humming a sound she called the darkness song. It was a wordless melody, hypnotic and strange, with fragments of biblical phrases woven together into nonsense sequences. The rhythm was uneven, the tone otherworldly. The sight of his wife and children moving together in harmony with that unsettling sound should have terrified him, but instead it froze him in place. The melody was not music in any recognizable sense. It had no clear structure, no logical progression. It was something else entirely, an echo of the basement itself, a language of shadows and confinement shaped by isolation and obsession. For the first time, Ezra glimpsed what his sanctuary had truly created. Not children preserved in innocence, but something far stranger. Something neither fully of the world above, nor wholly of his own making. Instead of seeing the darkness song as a warning sign of his family's unraveling, Ezra embraced it with a fervor that bordered on ecstasy. In his mind, it was confirmation that his methods had not only preserved his children's purity, but elevated them to a higher spiritual state. Samuel and Judith were no longer simply innocent. They were transcendent conduits of divine communion beyond ordinary human reach. That conviction filled Ezra with terrible joy, but also with gnawing paranoia. Every venture into Providence sharpened his sense that eyes were upon him, Neighbors who once greeted him with warmth now fell silent as he passed their whispers, cutting off too quickly. Congregants asked about his absent family with questions that sounded polite, but carried hints of suspicion. Business associates no longer lingered on the subject of his children, and when they did, their tone made Ezra wonder if they were probing for secrets. Worst of all were the children he encountered in the streets. Their games sometimes included chilling references to sounds. Beneath the ground-proof, Ezra believed that whispers of his sanctuary were seeping upward despite the thick stone walls. In his twisted logic, this scrutiny demanded stronger action. To protect Samuel and Judith from discovery, he began contemplating measures that would turn the sanctuary from a cloister into something darker, a place not just of isolation, but of entombment. Providence, he believed, was conspiring against his divine work. If purity was to survive, it must be walled off more completely than ever. The breaking point came on a sweltering July night in 1763. The twins were 9 months old, their development both a marvel and a terror to their father. The basement, once spacious, now seemed alive with their restless energy as they crawled across rugs and navigated their world with startling confidence. Samuel had grown sturdy, his pale skin almost translucent under the steady glow of the oil lamps, his dark eyes so adjusted to dimness they seemed bottomless. Judith remained smaller, but her auburn hair had grown long enough for Mercy to braid each morning, a ritual of tenderness that contrasted with the cold precision of Ezra's routines. What disturbed Ezra most, and delighted him in equal measure, was their strange form of communication. They no longer babbled like other infants, but crafted intricate exchanges of sound and gesture. Hours would pass as they sat facing one another, weaving their own language out of chanted syllables and coded motions. When one needed something, the other seemed to know instantly, responding without hesitation before either parent could intervene. To Ezra, this was undeniable proof his children were becoming something the world had never seen, creatures of purity shaped by his hand alone. Yet to anyone else, their eerie synchronicity and alien patterns of communication would have been terrifying. They were growing into the perfect products of his sanctuary children, molded not by nature, but by confinement obsession and a father's descent into madness. The bond between Samuel and Judith had become eerie in its perfection. They slept and woke together, fed in unison, and responded to each other's moods as though they shared a single consciousness. It was in the midst of this unsettling harmony that Goodwife Prescott appeared at the Rutherford home one gray evening, her arms full of herbs and her mind set on answers. She had heard the whispers circulating through Providence for months, rumors that no one had seen the Rutherford children since their birth, that strange sounds carried from beneath the house, and that Ezra's servants spoke of locked doors and forbidden rooms. For a woman who had delivered half the city's children, silence of this kind was intolerable. Her inquiries confirmed her unease. Merchants noted that Ezra's household orders had dwindled, suggesting fewer mouths than expected. Neighbors swore they heard children's voices rising from underground, their songs unlike any hymn sung in church. Servants spoke of orders never to set foot in the basement. For Prescott, a midwife with a reputation for bluntness and unshakable resolve, there was no choice left. She would see the twins with her own eyes, or she would bring back Dr. Hamilton and the deacons to force the issue. Ezra greeted her with his usual formality, but his cordial mask couldn't shake her determination. When he tried to deflect her with excuses about the late hour, she pushed harder, threatening to return with authority figures who would demand entry. To Ezra, this was the nightmare he had feared, his sanctuary under siege by the outside world. In that instant, something broke. Instead of yielding, he decided to confront Prescott head-on, to test her worthiness before she could threaten his work any further. He led her into the parlor rather than the basement, seating her beneath the solemn portraits of his ancestors, and began what he would later record in his journals as a trial of faith. For over an hour, he fired questions cloaked as theological discourse. What did she believe about innocence? How did she understand sin? Could she accept that children were either vessels of total purity or total corruption, with no in-between? His voice carried the fervor of a prophet, but his words revealed the unraveling of his reason. Prescott listened, her alarm mounting. He spoke of Providence as a city besieged by spiritual darkness, where every innocent soul was under attack. He outlined his conviction that only total isolation could preserve purity, his gray eyes blazing with the certainty of one who believed he had uncovered eternal truth. When she tried to steer the conversation back to practical matters, the health of Mercy, the nourishment of the twins, he dismissed her as worldly, accusing her of caring more for flesh than spirit. At last her patience snapped. Rising to her feet, Prescott made for the basement door, driven by the instincts of a woman who had spent her life protecting children. Ezra's mask of civility shattered. The confrontation was swift, a blur of motion and force that ended with the frail midwife overpowered by a man consumed by paranoia and zealotry. In his journals, he would later write of divine intervention, claiming God himself had strengthened his hand to protect the sanctuary. But the truth was simpler and darker. Ezra believed with every fiber of his being that letting Prescott into the basement would destroy everything he had built. In that moment, his obsession crossed the final threshold from a man preserving innocence to a man willing to destroy anyone who threatened the prison he had made of it. Goodwife Prescott fought with a ferocity that belied her age. Years of steady work delivering children had given her unexpected strength, and the knowledge that something terrible was happening in the Rutherford household fueled her resistance. But Ezra was younger, stronger, hardened by years of labor overseeing his ships, and driven by the conviction that he was defending his sacred mission. The struggle ended abruptly when Prescott's head struck the stone hearth with a sickening crack. The sound rolled through the parlor like a final verdict, sealing her fate and Ezra's. For one breathless moment, Ezra stood over her motionless body, caught between two choices. He could summon help and claim an accident, but doing so would mean questions, investigations, and inevitable scrutiny of his children's absence. Or he could silence the danger forever. In the haze of his unraveling mind, the decision felt less like murder and more like divine command. God, he believed, had shown him what must be done. He carried Prescott's body under cover of night to his warehouse by the harbor, abandoning it where violence and robbery were so common that her death would attract little more than a passing inquiry. True to his hopes, the constables quickly concluded she had been robbed and murdered by drifters. Her habit of carrying silver for patients made her a believable target, and the docks teemed with strangers no one could track. With the city distracted by the chaos of trade and crime, the only person bold enough to suspect Ezra's secrets was gone. But the act changed him. Killing Prescott created a new threshold in his mind, a line he could now cross without hesitation. If taking a life was necessary to protect purity, then it was not sin, but service. The twins, meanwhile, were nearing their first birthday, and their development fed both his pride and his dread. They communicated in a private language of sounds and gestures, bypassing normal speech altogether. They moved through the darkened basement as if born to it, their senses sharpening in ways that made them seem more like creatures of the underground than children of Providence. Most striking of all, they appeared perfectly content with their confined lives. They never cried for daylight, never reached toward the door, never displayed the restless curiosity of ordinary infants. To Ezra, this was final proof his experiment had worked. He had crafted children untainted by the corruption above. Mercy, however, was unraveling. Her body weakened, her skin pale and waxy from months without sunlight, and her mind slipped further into delusion. She lived in imagined worlds, holding conversations with friends who were not there, describing dinners and church services in rich detail, as though memory and fantasy had fused into reality. At times, she dressed carefully, waiting by the door for a service that would never come. Other times, she set places at the table for guests who existed only in her imagination. Ezra looked upon his wife's decline with a mix of denial and silent dread. She had become both a liability to his mission and a haunting reminder of the cost of his obsession. While Samuel and Judith grew into the twisted image of his vision, Mercy's slow collapse into madness revealed the darker truth that innocence preserved by isolation was not salvation at all, but destruction in disguise. The twins' strange empathy for their mother deepened as Mercy's mind unraveled. When she spoke to her imagined visitors, Samuel and Judith responded as though those figures were real, nodding, gesturing, and adding their own strange sounds at just the right moments. What might have been interpreted as compassion was in truth a chilling sign of their own separation from reality. They were no longer just confined. They were being shaped into something that no longer belonged to the world above. By the autumn of 1764, Ezra's theology had reached its inevitable breaking point. Months of fevered prayer convinced him that he himself had become the greatest threat to his children's purity. His nightly journeys into Providence's taverns and gambling dens, his deliberate exposure to corruption, meant he carried spiritual contagion back into the sanctuary. Every prayer whispered in their presence, every touch, every shared meal, he came to believe, all dripped with poison. Their innocence was being eroded by his very existence. The conclusion he reached was in his mind, as clear as it was monstrous. If even he could not remain in their presence without contaminating them, then the only solution was absolute separation. He would seal them in, shut off from the world above, protected from every influence, even his own. They would remain untouched forever. If their bodies weakened, if they starved, if they perished, so be it. What mattered was that their souls would ascend unblemished. In his final journal entries written in a hand that grew jagged with desperation, Ezra described this decision as an act of ultimate love. He called it the greatest gift a father could give innocence, preserved into eternity, salvation, guaranteed by the denial of life itself. In January 1765, during the bitter cold, when most of Providence huddled by their hearths, Ezra carried out his plan. Working silently through the nights, he reinforced the basement door with heavy timbers, layering mortar and plaster until it appeared no entrance had ever existed. He blocked the narrow ventilation windows, redirecting airflow so cleverly that the house's exterior betrayed no change. With the same meticulous skill he once used to manage ships and warehouses, Ezra transformed his cellar into a tomb. What came after haunted the neighborhood for months. Neighbors whispered of muffled cries drifting from beneath the house. Some claimed to hear scraping sounds as though desperate hands clawed at stone. Others swore the voices formed into unearthly songs, melodies that bore no resemblance to any Christian hymn. They rose at sunset and carried through the night until dawn, leaving those who heard them crossing themselves in fear and clutching their children tightly as they hurried past the Rutherford house. The sanctuary Ezra built to preserve purity had become something far darker, a sealed chamber of suffering that Providence would try for generations to forget. Ezra faced the growing suspicions of his neighbors with the same calm authority that had once made him a trusted leader. He explained away the unsettling noises from beneath his house as nothing more than timber creaking in the winter frost wind, whistling through old beams, or vermin scratching within the walls. To anyone who pressed harder, he suggested their fears came from spiritual weakness, not reality. His voice carried such conviction that most people, uneasy though they were, let themselves believe him. The truth was far worse than anything they imagined. Sealed inside the basement sanctuary, with no air-dwindling food and no escape, Mercy and the twins were slowly dying. Ezra had convinced himself this was not murder, but transcendence. What others would see as deprivation, he believed was purification, the final holy act that would preserve innocence forever. Mercy, her fragile mind, already worn thin by months of isolation, began to realize what her husband had done. Her imaginary conversations grew frantic, desperate attempts to pretend there was still a world outside their stone chamber. Samuel and Judith, too young to grasp death, but old enough to sense terror, responded with the eerie synchronized cries that had become their haunting language. Ezra, meanwhile, walked the streets of Providence as if nothing had changed. He conducted his business, stood in the pulpit, and prayed with parishioners. But cracks began to show. At night, neighbors saw him standing motionless outside his house, lips moving in quiet conversation, with voices only he could hear, the voices of his family fading in the darkness below. The strain of living between two realities pushed him into final collapse. In late February of 1765, during a church service, Ezra claimed to receive a revelation. He announced that the world had nothing more to offer him, that his soul's work was complete. Days later, he carried supplies down into the basement, sealed the door behind him, and vanished into the chamber he had built as both sanctuary and tomb. When his business partners finally forced entry into the house in March, they uncovered the truth. The basement revealed not a tragic accident, but a carefully engineered prison. The remains told a story of slow starvation, isolation, and a father's obsession turned into cruelty. Officially, Providence called it a collapse of the cellar during a harsh winter, an accident meant to protect the city's reputation and its trade. But those who saw the scene knew otherwise. The carvings, the lamps, the locked door all testified to deliberate confinement and deliberate death. The Rutherford house never truly recovered. Families who tried to live there fled within weeks, driven out by sounds of children singing in the walls, by the phantom scent of oil lamps burning where no flame existed, and by the ghostly touch of unseen hands brushing against their ankles. Ezra had sought to preserve purity, but in doing so created a legacy of horror that no one in Providence could forget. The tale of the Rutherfords remains a chilling reminder of how love, when twisted by fear and fanaticism, can become the cruelest form of destruction. Ezra believed he was saving his family's souls, but instead he entombed them in darkness, proving that the most terrifying monsters are often those who act in the name of devotion. So what do you think? Could a father's love really become so warped by extremism that he would sacrifice his entire family in the name of salvation? Share your thoughts below and tell us where you believe the line lies between protection and imprisonment. If this story unsettled you, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and pass it along to someone who finds meaning in exploring the darkest corners of human psychology. After all, sometimes the greatest horrors are born not from hatred,